Progress.
We can wait, but I can begin the housekeeping remarks if you like. Thank you. Let's begin with the housekeeping remarks, please.
Welcome and thank you for participating in today's meeting for the South Coast Air Quality Management District. If attending in person, please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room. To prevent disruptions, please silence all devices. All participants on Zoom, except for board members and South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each item, public comment will be taken. If you are participating in person and wish to comment, please use the iPads which are located in the lobby if the meeting is in the auditorium. For meetings in other locations, please complete a blue speaker card and provide the card to a South Coast AQMD employee. Information on how to participate in the meeting in Spanish using a telephone will be provided at the end of these housekeeping remarks. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all items on the agenda. The amount of time to comment may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. If interpretation is needed, more time will be allotted. For questions or issues related to making public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. In terms of decorum, if this meeting is taking place in the auditorium, no food or beverages are allowed in the auditorium. In accordance with state and local public health department guidelines, people may choose to wear a mask based on personal preference while in South Coast AQMD facilities. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Lastly, be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Buenos días. Gracias por participar en nuestra reunión híbrida del directorio de South Coast AQMD. Tenemos 3 formatos de participación: en persona, Zoom y conferencia telefónica. Los asistentes en persona no deben conectarse a la aplicación Zoom ni a la conferencia telefónica mientras estén en el auditorio. Por favor, silencie sus dispositivos de comunicación para evitar interrupciones durante la reunión. Todos los participantes en Zoom, excepto los miembros del directorio y el personal de South Coast AQMD, serán puestos en silencio. Usted no podrá silenciar o activar su línea manualmente. Esta reunión se está traduciendo al español. Para ver o escuchar esta reunión en el idioma de su preferencia, haga clic en el globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla denominado Interpretación. A partir de ahí, seleccione el idioma que prefiera. Después de seleccionar su idioma, si escucha ambos idiomas al mismo tiempo, haga clic en el Mute Original Audio. Para los participantes por conferencia telefónica, si desean escuchar la reunión en español, por favor llamen al 669-900-6833 e introduzca el número de identificación 932-09-55-9643. Esta información también está publicada en el calendario electrónico. Después de cada punto de la agenda, el presidente del directorio anunciará el periodo de comentarios públicos. Al hacer su comentario, por favor trate de mantener una cadencia de habla para ayudar a nuestros intérpretes a traducir simultáneamente. Los participantes en persona, por favor utilicen un iPad en la zona del vestíbulo para presentar su solicitud de comentario público. Su nombre será llamado cuando sea su turno para hablar. Para los que están en Zoom, por favor hagan clic en el botón Raise Hand si quieren hacer un comentario público. Para los participantes por conferencia telefónica, pueden marcar *9 para indicar que desean hacer comentarios. Su nombre o parte de su número de teléfono será llamado cuando sea su turno de comentar y automáticamente se abrirá la línea. Los comentarios públicos estarán limitados a un total de 3 minutos durante las partes de la agenda que se denominan calendario de consentimiento y calendario del directorio. A la vez, 3 minutos o menos para los demás puntos de la agenda. Con el fin de que todos tengan la oportunidad de ser escuchados, el presidente puede establecer un tiempo más corto. En la pantalla se mostrará un reloj atrás de cada comentario del público. Si necesita interpretación, se asignará más tiempo. Si tiene preguntas sobre comentarios públicos, por favor llame a la Secretaría del Directorio al 909-396-2500. Tenga en cuenta que puede colgar o abandonar la reunión de Zoom en cualquier momento. Se recomienda el uso de mascarillas, pero no es obligatorio para los participantes en persona. No se permite la entrada de alimentos o bebidas en el auditorio. Por favor, respete el límite de tiempo para hablar y trate a los demás con cortesía, civismo y respeto. Si no lo hace, su micrófono puede ser silenciado o usted puede ser retirado de la reunión. Por último, tenga en cuenta que esta reunión está siendo grabada. Al participar en esta reunión organizada por South Coast AQMD, usted está de acuerdo en autorizar la grabación de los contenidos audiovisuales presentados durante el evento en vivo y consiente el uso posterior de la grabación en el dominio público por parte de South Coast AQMD.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for the translation. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And Madam Clerk, can we call the roll, please?
Councilmember Cacciati,
Here.
Supervisor Doe, Supervisor Hagman, Vice Chair Padilla-Campos,
Morning. Here.
Councilmember Solace, absent, and Chair Perez.
Here. Thank you very much, Madam Clerk.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Caccioti, can you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes, Mr. Chair, be happy to. Everyone, please stand and face our flag. Place your right hand over your heart. Repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty, and justice for all.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Happy holidays. Merry Christmas, everyone. We have a full agenda today, but there will be a few changes that I'd like to make before I open up with my comments and then ask my colleagues in case they may have some comments as well. I'll open it up to our executive officer, our CEO, to Wayne. I'm seeing that we have quite a bit of participants. Is that correct? And rightly so. It's been 15 years since this committee has met. And I think for 15 years, people have been hanging on. And so because of the reason that after each presentation, I will open it up for people to state their ideas, their thoughts, their concerns. And then at the end of the meeting as well, I'm going to ask that we limit the public comment to 2 minutes per person. And that's after each overview, if you will, or each informational item, as well as at the end in conclusion of the meeting. Aside from that, we are making a change on the agenda. And that change is we're moving item number 2, overview of regulatory and policy framework for climate change, Dr. Sarah Reese, to number 3. And we will have Dr. Alex Haw, professor from UCLA, to speak after our welcoming and opening remarks, who will speak on climate change impacts in Southern California air quality as a result of him as a professor having to perhaps teach a class, continue writing his book, or coming up with more theories on air quality and climate change. Who knows? Nonetheless, though, just very happy that he's here. Our agenda today is one in which we will be speaking about impacts on Southern California air quality through climate change by Dr. Alex Hall, professor at UCLA, as well an overview of regulatory and policy framework for climate change by Dr. Sarah Reese, and an overview of U.S. EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program by Lisa Tanaka O'Malley. And then finally, obviously, our next steps. And fellow committee members, AQMD staff, my intention and commitment to this committee is to establish strong partnerships with key stakeholders like AQMD and CARB to meet our state's ambitious targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate goals. I understand that climate change and greenhouse gas emissions do not stop at geographic boundaries. And that is why it is critical that our work in this committee be in partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, and where possible, with international agreements to combat climate change. And that's key, as I've learned over the course of my tenure as a county board supervisor, as a member of AQMD, as a member of the Mojave Desert Air Quality Management District, and as a new member of California Air Resources Board. The partnerships are critical in order for us to truly deal with climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to clean our air. And especially when it comes to clarifying and working with our communities on the ground. I've learned that Coachella Valley Water District, Fountain Sea Authority, the Imperial Irrigation District, even our county, many times don't communicate, don't have these type of discussions. And I think it's important that we do, because one entity alone can't do it all. And the more we're able to define and clarify that for our communities, especially our communities on the ground that are working on a daily basis to survive, folks get confused. And I think it's our job to do everything we can to work in partnership with all these entities and bring about the resources, the programs, the services, the better air quality, fight greenhouse gas emissions alongside our communities. The impacts of climate change, especially on communities of color, cannot be understated. Therefore, our strategies in this committee should and must include adaptation of measures to enhance resilience in vulnerable communities. To give you another example, in the community of North Shore, we've had major storms, and in the Coachella Valley as a whole, Thousand Palms area, Palm Springs, you might have heard of the 1,000-year natural disaster or storm. They call it 100-year storm, but this seemed like it was 1,000-year storm because of all the disaster that it brought in the Palm Springs, Desert Hot Springs, Thousand Palms area, but as well in the North Shore area and the Mecca area. That seems to be an ongoing issue. At least twice, 3 times a year, we're dealing with natural disasters out there, and we need to do everything we can to make our communities more resilient. And then how do we do our part to do everything possible to prevent, and if not prevent, mitigate those disasters that take place in our communities? Collaborative efforts are crucial for achieving meaningful and lasting change on a scale that aligns with the urgency of the climate crisis. I believe the AQMD holds a critical role in combating greenhouse gas emissions and climate change in Southern California and beyond. And I had a good conversation with Wayne and staff on this. And CARB has its role and its responsibilities. AQMD has its role and its responsibilities in all the air quality management districts throughout the state of California. But how do we get to a place, once again, and we're seeing each other as partners? How do we get to that place where we're working with one another to ensure ultimately that we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're bringing about air quality, and not only in the state of California or in our own backyards, but nationally and internationally? And how do we ensure that China plays a role? And how do we ensure that Mexico plays a role? How do we ensure that the community of Bell plays a role, and the community of Indio plays a role, and LA and Torrance and Sacramento? All this, some way, somehow, needs to get integrated. And I think that this committee is a committee, aside from the others, to work on those efforts. I believe that this committee can play a key role in promoting the transition to clean renewable energy sources and sustainable alternatives. And we must also look for ways for disadvantaged communities to participate in the transition towards electric vehicles and infrastructure to support that transition. And folks already know that my neck of the woods, it gets pretty hot. You don't believe me? Go show up in August and you'll find 120-degree weather. You won't find me there. I'll be at the beach surfing. But it's extremely hot, folks. And as a result of that, we have opportunities for solar. At the same time, because of the South Sea, the lithium conversation is now taking place, and we have opportunities for wind and geothermal. But how do we expand on those efforts? Now, I see our role as trying to focus on a few pillars, and that is infrastructure, workforce, funding streams, and partnerships. If you will, that would be the four stools or four legs to a table. But the overarching, I think, goal for me is, while we're doing all this, how do we ensure that we don't keep people in poverty? How do we ensure that ultimately there is an indirect, for lack of better words, hit, if you will, on our communities, in which it keeps them impoverished and them not able to keep up with the new demands that are coming from our entities? How do we make it so that we do have that infrastructure, but then provide incentives so that people can truly charge their vehicles from an electric charger that's not broken? And then how do we make that electric vehicle affordable? There's just many things for us to consider, but I think for me, the overarching goal ultimately is to ensure that folks that are disadvantaged, that we are here to work for, work with, to protect and serve, that we don't hurt them indirectly. We are here to benefit them. And I'm fearful of passing rules or MOUs or regulations or bills that can potentially hurt our communities. So I think that that is also another role of this committee. So with that, I'd like to open it up to my colleagues, specifically, first and foremost, our committee vice chair, who happens to be on the line, board member Veronica Padilla Campos, if she has any words to say. If not, then I'll open up to my colleagues on the dais.
My technology is not advanced. I have to get up to unmute. Thank you for the opportunity. I think you said a lot, Chair. Very important for you to open up this way, because I recognize it's been a while since we've met. I'm just really glad we're here today and having these very important conversations. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Colleagues on the dais? I see Kurt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, thank you for calling this. And, I read through the amount of information you gave us is quite a bit. And there was a lot of the presentations. You said a lot, and I have some of the same, concerns. I think if we had our magic wand and unlimited resources, and love to hear from staff, if we could do everything within our preview, it's probably not going to change a lot in global warming, because we are the leader of clean air around the world right now, and we're setting the standards up pretty high. And every time we pass a new rule or regulation, and I feel from the business and our residents, it is hurting them. And so how fast can we push this to really, and can we make a difference? But at the same time, I see that our role to be coordinated with CARB and to try to set the standards and get the visibility up to be leaders of not only North America, but hopefully internationally. And a lot of us traveled to the places where they have no standards, and where we see a lot of the problems are occurring, is we can't talk until we set the example the best way we can. So I think we're doing that already. And so, I'm trying to figure out the happy balance of how we keep the ball rolling, but not to the point where, like you said, Mr. Chair, that it hurts our residents in such a way that they can't recover or chases businesses out of our jurisdiction where that we don't have decent jobs for them and so on and so on. I think to coordinate good with well with CARB and set that vision for state of California, that at least is a little more even playing field for our businesses not to escape. And just my own county, they can just cross over that hill and leave our air district into the high desert. It's completely different standards. And we see more and more of that happening. And I don't know if that's a benefit to us or not, because I got more and more people going up and down the freeway because of that. And so as we push our agenda forward, keeping in mind the practical side of our rules and regulations, the cost, and what does it really do? That we're really accomplishing our goals by passing new rules. At the same time, I think you're completely right with coordinating with CARB and international and trying to get more resources and all the rest for our region to set that goal. And then I look at Wayne and the staff, and after the last couple of hearings of budget and staff, holes, how much can we really do at this point and add to keep our primary mission? Number one, our primary mission is to, set the standards and regulate and enforce the rules. And if it takes 2 or 3 years to get a permit out, we're not doing our primary role, our primary mission well enough to handle more. So I look at some of the comments from our team. Can we take on more? Practically speaking, with the resources and the staff that we have right now, really to go outside. So it's what I would call mission creep. Are we creeping into the CARB, California Air Resources Board, mission for California? I think the coordination and communication is outstanding. I don't know how much more we could do since we're probably the premier one as far as setting those rules first for the rest of the state as it is. But if there's opportunities to, I guess, message well to the federal government and to message out to outside our government and to other countries and stuff and saying this is how we do it, and we could do so and still keeping our primary mission going, then yeah, I think we should take a look at it. But it's better than closing the door and not thinking about it at all. So those are, I'm trying to figure out how far we go and what we can do on the practical side of things. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague Hagman. Colleague Caccioli, do you have a few words?
Mr. Chair, I do, and I 100% agree with your comments, your vision, your outline, and Supervisor Hagman's balanced approach and his concerns not to just do nothing. But as I heard you speak, as Supervisor Hagman spoke, I reflected on this a lot this week. And actually, I was engaging in some other ideas. But as you spoke, you just gave me another idea, and Wayne's gonna look at me. Don't give Caccioli any ideas. And I was speaking with my pastor last week, just simple things about what we can do at the church. He's a new pastor. He grew up in Wilmington. He had asthma. We had a long talk. We're going to meet again next week. He wanted to meet again after our talk about what goes on at AQMD. So as I hear you speak and hear our limited resources, I see what we did here when I first got on the board, maybe 2010. Pushed forward, and we had a really huge outreach to our faith communities. Because you're right, we have limited resources. Mr. Chair, Kurt talked about it right. Mission creep, but we have a position in this community, in these 4 counties, where we work with even the millions, 17 million people. Most of those belong to some faith community. So I'm talking to our brothers and sisters in the Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, all of these faith communities. And they've all got a stake in this too. And Manny, what you're doing, this is so timely. It's incredible. You talk about COP28 in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, just finished. You've talked about, and I'm going to read from this gentleman. Does anybody know who this person is? And I hope Kurt better know. His name is Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He's a very important person, came to power maybe 15, 20 years ago. He wrote something, I want to read it just very quickly, in October to all the people of the world. He's probably the most well-known religious figure in the world. He said 8 years ago, I'm giving you his name because he comes from Argentina, he's Italian descent. He's probably from Wayne's area. 8 years have passed since I published the encyclical letter Laudato Si, in praise of you, God, and nature, when I wanted to share with all of you, my brothers and sisters of our suffering planet, my heartfelt concerns about the care of our common home. Yet, with the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. While the world in which we live is collapsing and may be nearing a breaking point. In addition to this possibility, it's indubitable that the impact of climate change will increasingly prejudice the lives and families of many persons, which you, Manny, and the supervisor have experienced and talked about. We will feel the effects in the areas of healthcare, sources of employment, access to resources, housing, force, et cetera. He goes on, the global social issue. What I think we can do as you're doing this, I was kind of thinking about this too, Manny, talking to the pastor, is as we move on in this next year, and Kurt, you obviously know that's Pope Francis. And Kurt and I are talking to the Christian community, which we both belong, and Manny yourself probably, is that we bring together all the different, we start with, whether it's a Roman Catholic Church, which is massive amount of churches here, then all the Christian churches, the Muslim, or bring them all together at once, the leaders. As part of this, sometime next year, as we're looking at this, because some of those people are taking action. And like you and the supervisor, we can't do it alone. But if we pull the resources, the millions of people that have faith and know that there's an issue, we can really make a change. So I'm supportive. You're timely. This is incredible. All this is coming together at once. So just very excited. Thank you, Chair, and everyone else.
Thank you, colleague Caccioli. Thank you, colleague Caccioli. Are there colleagues on the Zoom call that'd like to speak, Wayne?
Supervisor Doe is on, but I'm not sure if he would like this. His hand is raised.
I think his hand is raised.
Yes.
Right,
Yes,
thank you.
Supervisor
Can you hear
Doe.
me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. A lot of what I wanted to say was already said, so I don't want to repeat them. But I do want to compliment you, Chair, for your insightful comments, raising the profile of this issue. Not that it needs raising, because I think everyone's aware of it, but to take the leadership role that AQMD, South Coast AQMD, plays internationally in terms of policy setting, and to set the stage for the conversations that we need to have with our communities and our stakeholders to address an issue that, frankly, I think, in my opinion, one of the, if not the most important issue that we face. For those of us growing up in the 70s in Southern California, and remember the air quality back then, and now at our age, as we are about to hand the baton off to the next generation, we hold a great responsibility in knowing that we have done our share in making the world as good of a place as we can for future generations. And I love the balance presented in your comments. I cannot share with you any more wholeheartedly my support for everything you said. I'm a big adherent in electrification. I've been driving hybrid cars pretty much from the beginning for the last 12 years. And so as I read the news every day, I grow more and more concerned about climate change. And for us to start this conversation now is timely. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Doe. Staff, anyone else in the queue?
No.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone on the dais, as well as Supervisor Doe, as well as our Vice Chair, Maria Campos, for your words. And Wayne, are there any opening comments on your behalf?
Thank you, Supervisor. You've laid out a very ambitious agenda, and there are many challenges that you described and that we certainly foresee. I think first and foremost, our primary goal is to achieve the national ambient air quality standards. But as you note, and as all the committee members note, you can't turn on the news, you can't pick up a paper without seeing something about climate change. And what you will hear today is what is going on with climate change? What is climate change? And what are some of the things that we're doing about that? The legs of the table that you set, Supervisor, the workforce, the infrastructure, the funding, and the partnership. These are things that we as an organization are certainly familiar with. And I look forward to reporting back on the efforts that we will undertake at the direction of this committee to highlight those actions, their impacts on climate. And I think what will be most surprising to many is how much of the efforts are harmonized and are harmonious. The things that we do to address air quality also address climate change. The things that we do to address climate change affect air quality. You're going to hear about numerous efforts to address almost each and every component that you've described today, Supervisor. So with that, I'm going to save all of the excitement for our presenters and really look forward to the discussion after the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, for your comments. And just to check in very quickly, was that translated? All that was said, translated by our translators?
Yes.
All right, good to know. So at this point now, we're going to go ahead and move on with the agenda, if that's okay. And as I mentioned earlier, we're moving up number 3 to number 2, and number 2 will become number 3. And we have UCLA professor, Dr. Alex Hall, and I believe, Wayne, you're going to introduce him.
Yes, thank you. Professor Hall is the UCLA Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Science and Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, along with being the UCLA Director of the Center for Climate Science. He's the lead author of the 5th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change chapter on regional climate change and lead author on the Los Angeles region, California 4th Climate Change Assessment. His work has involved developing downscaling techniques that help understand the impacts of climate change at scales relevant to people and ecosystems. And with that, Dr. Hall.
Welcome, Dr. Hall. And for my colleagues, you have the slides before you, and as well, folks that are watching, you should be able to access them through the internet.
Great. Are you all able to hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I'm not able to turn on my video, but I am here. So I very much appreciate the invitation to speak to you all. And I am really thrilled to be able to give you some sense of the scientific perspective on climate change. I really enjoyed the remarks that were made earlier, and one thing that really resonated with me is the concept that we really do need many different perspectives on this very critical societal challenge. There's the spiritual perspective, there's the political perspective, the economic perspective, and there's also the scientific perspective. And that's the one that I can offer to you. I have been working for about 2 decades now to try to understand how climate change will play out across landscapes like what we have in Southern California. And I've also been working a lot with what we call the stakeholder community, which is really you all, the people who are in a position to make decisions around climate policy. And I view my job as really to make sure that that you have access to the highest quality scientific information, and that you can make decisions that are informed by the best information that we have. So that's really my goal. And when I created this presentation, I thought I would very quickly give you an overview of climate change at the global scale. And this is you're going to have to forgive me because it might be very basic to you, but I thought it would be good to just start at the very basic level and then move on to talk about how climate change intersects with air quality issues in Southern California, and give you some kind of a menu as to which of the challenges are out there relating to climate change and air quality, so that as you decide how to invest your resources, you at least can make decisions about which things you want to prioritize. Because I understand that you can't do everything, but I'll at least try to map out a bit of a menu. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so just to start with the basics, why do we have this thing called climate change? Well, you've undoubtedly heard about the greenhouse effect. The planet has a natural greenhouse effect, which keeps our planet habitable. And there's a kind of a blanket of air, obviously, around the planet, and there is a trapping of heat by that blanket, by the atmosphere. And what's happening is that blanket is thickening because of the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of the burning of fossil fuels, which we've been doing at a very rapid pace since about 1800. And that is causing temperatures to increase. So, at a very basic level, the energy that the Earth receives has to equal the energy it's going out. And these greenhouse gases, they absorb some of the energy that's being emitted out to space, and they redirect it back towards the surface. And when we increase greenhouse gases, we increase that energy that's directed back towards the surface, and that results in the temperatures having to go up in order to restore the planet's balance. And so if you look on the lower right here, you can see the observations of carbon dioxide since about 1960. This is what's been observed at Mauna Loa Observatory. This is one of the most famous plots in the environmental sciences. The information that we have about the concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide at a particular location. This is a very pristine location in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And even at this location, we can see the imprint of this global increase in carbon dioxide. And we see this increase at many locations around the world. And it dates to about 1800, the beginning of the increase. And that, of course, coincides with the era of burning of fossil fuels. So this is, fundamentally what is creating the climate change challenge. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to get a little bit in the weeds here on the science, but I think it's worth it, to talk about this. People ask me all the time, how do we know that climate change is caused by this increase in greenhouse gases? Well, we have ways of simulating the climate. These are like virtual Earths, and we can do experiments with them. Luckily, we have these virtual laboratories that we can do experiments with, and we can try to understand the impact of, say, increases in greenhouse gases on the climate, or increases in other things that might affect the climate. And we can see what happens without actually doing it in the real world. And these are tools that we call global climate models. They are simulation systems that mimic the observed behavior of the climate system. So if we take these models, there are roughly 30 models of these that have been developed around the world. And each one of these models, you can do an experiment with it. You can impose the observed increase in carbon dioxide and other things that are known to affect climate on these models, and you can see what happens to the globally averaged temperature. And so that's what's being shown here. This is a graph that shows the globally average temperature from 1850 to roughly the present. And the black curve on there is the observed warming. So that's what we've actually seen with by compiling all the measurements from all the thermometers around the world. And then we can also compare that observed change in temperature to the change in temperature that occurs in these climate models when we impose the observed increase in greenhouse gases. And that's what's being shown in the this kind of brown beige curve where it says simulated human and natural. That's the behavior in the models that occurs when we include this increase in greenhouse gases. And you can see that it matches this observed warming quite well. On the other hand, if we take all these models and we impose only the natural forcings, only the factors that are affecting climate that are natural, in other words, not the greenhouse gases, but only things like volcanoes, maybe changes in the strength of the sun. These are natural factors that we don't have any control over. If you impose those on the models, you get this kind of blue curve, this green-blue curve here, towards the bottom. And you can see that in those simulations, there is no warming, or there's very little warming. And in fact, the globally average temperature in those simulations does not agree at all with the observed. And in science, when something doesn't agree with observations, then that's a view of the world that we have to discard, because we are constantly comparing, our theories about the world to observations. And if they don't match up, the scientific method is to say, well, we have to embrace the thing that matches the observations. And in this case, it's only when we include the increase in greenhouse gases that we can match the observations. And so this is the main basis for the main evidence that we have that the observed warming is indeed due to the increase in greenhouse gases that has occurred since we began burning fossil fuels roughly a couple hundred years ago. Okay, next slide. All right, so we've already seen this warming manifest at a more regional scale. This is just a change in temperature over the past couple decades in the US. We've already seen significant warming, especially in the Western US. And if you look at the warming that's occurred since, say, 1850, it's much greater than this, of course. And in this past year, I'm sure you've probably read in the news that we are breaking all kinds of temperature records globally, that this is a very unusual year, and that we are starting to bump up against some of the thresholds that have been discussed in the international negotiations around climate. The threshold of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit. We're beginning to bump up against those thresholds because of the observed warming, which is global, and not only in the US. Okay, next slide. All right, so I've been talking about kind of the impact of greenhouse gases on the changes in the average temperatures. But it turns out that the biggest impacts in terms of the warming are on the extremes in temperature. So the chair of the committee talked about the extreme heat in parts of Southern California. And often, we have heat waves. These are extreme weather events that are linked to morbidity and mortality, especially among disadvantaged communities and our most vulnerable populations. And so if we look at the impact of this warming on people, on ecosystems, it's really felt in the extremes. And this cartoon here, this diagram, illustrates the impact of the change in the mean temperature on the extremes. So this is a little bit, let me unpack this here for you. So, if you look at the gray curve, the one on the left, that shows that's just the probability or the likelihood that a temperature will occur in the current climate. And if you look at the middle of the gray curve here, that is the most likely value. That's like the mean temperature in the current climate. But of course, we have some very cold days, and we also have some very warm days. And we can define, say, a very warm day as a day that exceeds a certain threshold of temperature. So of course, as we get into the very warm days and the very cold days, the chances that those days are going to occur decreases. And, for the most part, the temperature kind of wobbles around the mean. But if we then warm the climate, so we can shift this whole curve now, this whole gray curve to the right, and we are now in a future world where the temperatures have increased, then we see that this impacts the extremes really dramatically. So if you look at this threshold that defines the extremely hot weather, we can see that in the current climate, this threshold is not breached very often. But if we move this whole curve to the right, this threshold might be breached 5 times as frequently or much more frequently. And we also get new types of extreme weather, extremely hot weather, that have almost no likelihood of happening in the historical climate. And we've seen examples in recent years of unprecedented heat waves. And this is the manifestation of this effect of the warming on heat extremes. And so with these warmer temperatures, we expect to see increases in heat waves and an increased frequency of temperatures exceeding thresholds that are dangerous to people and ecosystems, and also incidentally have an impact on air quality, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so we can use these global climate models that I mentioned not only to ask questions about what's causing the climate change that we've seen historically, but also to make projections of future climate change. So these global simulations of climate, I mentioned we can do experiments with them. You can kind of play God with them, if you will. And one of the experiments that the global scientific community has come up with is to impose standard scenarios of emissions of carbon dioxide in the future on these models. And so there's a kind of a jargon here that the community has come up with. There are these scenarios that are called SSPs. These are pathways of socio-political and economic development in the future that are associated with different levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, there is a scenario called SSP 585. It's the top scenario there on this left-hand plot. And by the way, this plot shows the global temperature change relative to a baseline period of 1850 to 1900. The black is the historical warming that we've already talked about. And then if you can see, these different scenarios are forking off into different futures that are associated with different emissions. So the SSP 585 scenario is the one that is associated with a scenario of economic development that involves basically burning all the fossil fuels that are in the ground as fast as we can. And that produces a very large increase in global temperature, as you might imagine. And so we get warming of 5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, which is, something like 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the globally averaged warming. And then with these other scenarios, there are reduced levels of warming. So like the SSP 245, that's the middle one. That's this kind of orange colored one. That one is the one that is associated with the Paris Climate Agreement, which you probably have heard about. That's one where we do agree to globally reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide, but it's happening at a probably a slower pace than we really need. But nonetheless, it avoids the worst outcomes of the burn it all scenario of the SSP 585. And then there are other scenarios that involve even deeper efforts towards decarbonizing our economy globally. And those are very ambitious and very optimistic. But nonetheless, we want to understand what their impact is on climate. And so these are agreed upon scenarios of emissions that we impose now on these different global models. I mentioned there are a few dozen of them around the world. They have agreed upon emission scenarios that they take into account to imposed on these models. And so on the right, you can see the average temperature change, but now globally distributed over the whole globe. So if we look at the lower right, this is one of the scenarios. You can see the distribution of warming that is projected by the end of the century under this scenario. This is one of the more aggressive emission scenarios. So quite a bit of warming, but you can see that the warming is not distributed uniformly. There are certain places where it warms more. The continents warm more than the oceans. The high latitudes, the Arctic warms more than the rest of the planet, and so on. But nonetheless, we can make a projection then of what we expect the temperatures to be on average in the future. So next slide, please. All right, so before I moved to California about more than 20 years ago now, I had been working only with these global climate models. And I became very fascinated very quickly with the incredible changes in climate that we have in California across the landscape. For example, in the Coachella Valley, the climate is so different from the top of Mount San Jacinto. If anyone's taken the funicular there, it's such a dramatic change in climate. And likewise, that climate is different from the Inland Empire, which is also different from the more coastal part of Los Angeles. And even within LA, we have differences between the San Fernando Valley and say Santa Monica or Venice. And so there are just these dramatic changes in climate across the landscape. And these are influenced by the incredible topography and mountains that we have in the region. But these mountains are not represented in our global climate models because the global models are designed for global climate investigations, and they have a very coarse resolution. And so if you look on the upper right here, you can see the effective resolution of a global climate model in California. You can see that the Sierra Nevada is kind of represented like a big hill almost. And so, of course, we don't get anything like representation of the mountains that we know are important for climate in Southern California. And so I became really fascinated with this, and I began to shift my work from working with global models to developing tools that we can use to investigate climate at the landscape scale in Southern California. And so I began developing regional climate models. These are models that are very much like global models, but they are focused on a particular area, and they are run at very high resolution. And so if you look at the lower right, this is an example of a regional climate simulation. These are the mountains in such a simulation. And you can see that we resolve the main features of the topography in California very well. And by the way, these are climate change data that we're producing for the state of California for the 5th California Climate Assessment. And this data will be available very soon in a tool called CalAdapt, which you may be familiar with. So that's a tool that you might consider a publicly available tool to understand how climate change plays out across a landscape like the one that's encompassed by the Air Quality Management District. So just so you know, this data is actually something that is used by the state and is provided by the state to users like yourself. Okay, next slide. So I'm just giving you a flavor of what we see in some of these regional simulations. So these are projected increases in average maximum temperatures in California in these simulations. And if you look on the right-hand side, by the end of the century, you see pretty significant changes in temperature. This is average temperature. So up to 7 degrees Fahrenheit in the inland areas. And one of the themes that we see consistently in these regional simulations is that the inland areas warm a lot more than the coastal areas. We already have a pre-existing difference in climate between the inland areas and the coastal areas, with the inland areas being much warmer already. And we project that those regions will become even warmer than the coastal areas in the future, and will experience more warming. So it's kind of like a double whammy. Um, and with, of course, many impacts on heat extremes. And so we have to be very careful in thinking about how we invest resources in adaptation, and making sure that we are investing resources in communities where the impact is the greatest, and also where the vulnerability is the greatest. And so the data like this can be, I think, very informative for understanding how to invest scarce resources. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this is some work that we did for the city of LA. This is a few years ago now. We projected changes in very hot days in LA County. And these are different parts of the LA area, essentially. And the key on the bottom shows the changes in very hot days. And very hot days are defined as days where the maximum temperature exceeds 35 degrees centigrade or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see that if you look at this period 1981 to 2000, this is our baseline period. This key here on the lower left shows the number of days that exceed this threshold in this historical period, 1981 to 2000. And so you can see the difference in climate across the landscape, like, for example, the difference between the San Fernando Valley and Santa Monica. Santa Monica has very few days that exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the historical period. But in the San Fernando Valley, especially in the northern part of the valley, you're getting 60 days per year that exceed this threshold. But then if you look at the future and you look at the middle of the century, under a scenario of emissions that is a pretty aggressive one, where we're burning a lot of fossil fuels, you can see that the number of extremely hot days doubles in the San Fernando Valley, and you get up to up well over 100 days of extreme heat in places like San Fernando and Porter Ranch. And in coastal areas like Santa Monica and Venice, you see almost no change in extreme heat. And that's, again, because these areas start out quite a bit cooler and also experience a smaller warming in the future. And this pattern is reproduced as you go further inland as well. So if we look at the Coachella Valley, and apologies, this area, I don't have the data for it plotted here, but those areas see changes that are also dramatic, like Porter Ranch and San Fernando. And in many places in Southern California that are inland, with these types of scenarios of warming, we see almost like a new season of extreme heat in these areas. So we're really proud. We worked with the LA County Department of Public Health to give them information about extreme heat, and they've been thinking about how to invest resources in protecting vulnerable populations. And so they have this social vulnerability index, and they've overlaid that on the projections of heat extremes to decide how to invest resources in cooling centers in LA County. And that's an example of where we can use scientific information and data to make sure that we are investing resources wisely, and that we're not protecting communities that don't need protection, say wealthy communities, and we're also not protecting communities where the impacts are not projected to occur. So that's an example of how we can work with agencies and governmental entities to make better policy decisions. Next slide. All right, so now getting into air quality, and this is where I divided this into 3 different impacts of climate on air quality that I think are relevant to you. One is the impact of temperature on air quality, which is a known impact. That's one. And then another is the impact of wildfire and the increases in megafire that we've seen in the past few years, which is another climate change impact. that impacts air quality also, and it intersects with pre-existing air quality challenges that you have policy levers over. And then also there's drought and its impact on dust generation, which is another one that I want to talk about, especially as it impacts the Imperial Valley and Coachella valleys. So next slide, please. Okay, so first, talking about the impact of warming on just air quality itself. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, within the region, there are differences in air quality. And if you look at, say, on the left-hand side here, the number of days that federal ozone standards are exceeded, historically, that's much more frequent in the interior part of the region than it is near the coast. And part of that is because of a transport issue where the inland areas are unfortunately impacted by pollutants that are produced in the coastal areas. But part of that is also because the higher temperatures do increase the rate of chemical reactions that lead to poor air quality, and those effects are greater inland. And so then if you combine that with projections of warming, which we're showing on the right-hand side here, these are some of the projections of warming that we did a few years ago. These are the average August temperatures on the top for this historical period of 1981 to 2000. And the bottom is the average warming under a pretty aggressive emission scenario by the middle of the century. And you can see that there's a lot more increase in temperature in the inland areas than in the coastal areas, as we've been talking about. And because the chemical reactions that do lead to air quality degradations are sensitive to temperature, we expect the inland areas to be more affected by this warming signal. So that's something to keep in mind, that climate change is exacerbating the existing regional kind of inequality, if you will, in air quality impacts. And so that's something to keep in mind as you think about how to move the policy levers that you have control over. This is an effect that I think is important to keep in mind. Okay, next slide, please. The next impact that I wanted to talk about was wildfire. So next slide. It turns out that we have developed a wildfire challenge in California and in many other parts of the world. This is not unique to California. We've seen huge increase in fire in Spain and Portugal, in Australia. There were very dramatic fires in Canada this year. And it turns out that they are driven by warming in part. And so if we know this because of work that's been done in the past few years to try to understand the relationship between area burned and temperature. So in this plot here, this is fire in forest areas in California. And every single circle here corresponds to a year worth of data. And basically we've taken that year of data and we've added up all the area burned that year. And that's what's being shown on the y-axis here. It's millions of acres burned every single year. And then on the x-axis is it's a quantity we call vapor pressure deficit, but it's really just a proxy for temperature. So temperature is increasing as we go towards the right here. So every year you have two data points. You have millions of acres burned and the temperature that year, basically. And if you scatter those against one another, you see something very interesting, which is that the area burned increases really dramatically as the temperature increases. And you can also see the effect of the change in temperature over this time period because the color coding is revealing the difference between the period 1984 to 1999, which is the last couple of decades or so of the 20th century, versus the first couple decades of the 21st century, We know the 21st century has been warmer than the end of the 20th century, again, because of greenhouse gas increases. And those red dots are uniformly on the right-hand side of the plot, so they're warmer, and they are also associated with much larger increases in area, or much larger area burned. And so this is a very graphic illustration of the mega fire challenge. We are seeing really big fires developing, and it appears to be in part because the speed at which fires spread and the intensity of fires is sensitive to temperature. And as we warm the planet, we are increasing the size of fires. And this is, by the way, a pattern that's been reproduced globally. If you look at other regions of the world, they show the same sensitivity of area burned to temperature. So this leads to an air quality challenge. If you go to the next slide. We have a lot of public health experts who have been looking at this, and they have been looking at wildfire smoke exposure. And we think of wildfire as a environmental challenge in wild areas, but it has a big impact on urban areas. And I'm sure you all remember the kind of apocalyptic year that we had in 2020, for example, when we had several mega fires burning at once in California. And this produced a dramatic impact on air quality. And if we compare the average number of smoke days per year in, say the last 5 years of the last decade, compared to just a few years before that, we see a pretty big increase in the wildfire smoke exposure. And so this has an impact on air quality. And this wildfire smoke, of course, interacts with the pollutants in the atmosphere that are due to emissions, say, from tailpipes and factories, and produces effects that I don't think we fully understand on air quality, and do create a severe public health challenge. And I know that when, for example, in 2020, when we had a month of really terrible air quality from wildfires, that really had a huge impact on especially vulnerable communities and people with pre-existing health conditions. So this is really a public health challenge, and it does intersect, again, as I mentioned, with the aspects of air quality that we have more control over through regulation. So I think this is another one to keep in mind as you consider what areas you might want to focus on. Okay, next slide. And the final effect that I want to talk about is the impact of drought on air quality. So next slide. I'm sure that you've been following the crisis that is occurring in the Colorado River. Over the past 20 years or so, the Colorado River watershed has entered into a mega drought. And this mega drought has resulted in a real crisis in the Colorado River system. And it is in part natural in origin. If we look at, we have ways of looking deeper into the past in this region and looking at the variations in precipitation going back a few hundred years. And we know that there have been precipitation deficits that are similar to the ones we're seeing now in the Colorado River watershed. However, there is also, in addition, the effect of warming. And the warming that is due to, again, to the emission of fossil fuel combustion products like CO2, that has led to an increase in evaporation from soils and snow and plants, which has reduced the stream flow further into Lakes Powell and Mead. So about 30 or 40% of the stream flow deficit into these reservoirs is due to warming. And so part of this crisis is because of climate change. And it is having an impact in Southern California because we historically are reliant on this water source in the region. The Metropolitan Water District, of course, provides this water to urban customers, but also the farmers in the Imperial Valley, in the Coachella Valley, also rely on it. And the dwindling resources of the Colorado River and the need to conserve water is in part why the Salton Sea has been declining. And as this decline occurs, it results in emission of dust. And that in many cases, the dust is unfortunately toxic and has big public health consequences for people living in this area. And so, and this is in part an impact of a changing climate. And in addition, as the climate warms, the evaporation itself from the Salton Sea accelerates. I think this is a somewhat overlooked impact of warming. And that's accelerating the shrinking of the Salton Sea, which again is creating this dust challenge and this which is an air quality issue. And so this is another aspect of climate change, the increasing tendency towards drought and dust emissions in certain places. I think it's something that is also an impact of climate change. So that I believe is my last slide. I think if you go to my next one, it's my thank you. So I appreciate very much again the opportunity to speak to you. I tried to give you again, just a kind of a very broad overview and kind of a menu of the air quality impacts that I think are directly flowing from the changing climate that we've observed. Yeah, happy to talk further about this, and just grateful also for the opportunity to help you frame this conversation as you renew your focus on climate change.
Well, thank you, Dr. Alex Hall, for your thorough presentation. Obviously, there's a lot for us to consider and all that, and it's always good to have another one-on-one. People get confused many times between the difference between climate change and air quality, and then the interaction between them. So I appreciate the conversation. Any questions or thoughts from my colleagues on the dais or on Zoom?
Just real briefly, Mr. Chair,
Yeah,
because
go
I know we
ahead.
got a packed schedule. First of all, go Bruins. I'm an alumni. My kids are multiple degree alumni there. I think I actually took that class, but way before you were there because you're way too young to teach it. But looking at the global stuff, and understand we're focused on the last couple hundred years of man, or more recently, last 40 or 50 years of industrialization. How do you explain some of the dramatic slides in the earth without us here, like Ice Age and other things going on? And then he brought up Salton Sea, and I was always under, Manny probably knows this history a lot better than I do. I thought a lot of that was because aqueducts overflowed in 1905 and flooded out Salton Sea, and then we fixed it again. But the Colorado River was feeding that at different parts. So I just wondering, do we use that because it's a man-made originally, to show that it's also man-made because it's drying up now? So just couple observations. I was wondering how we explain the world before we were here impacting it ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that there's been a lot of thought put into. You mentioned the Ice Age. We about 18 to 20,000 years ago, the planet was significantly cooler than it was in say 1800, before we started emitting fossil fuel byproducts into the atmosphere. It was, somewhere probably around, 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than it was in 1800. So it was significantly cooler. And part of that, is we think that those variations in climate, and if you go back even further, like over the past couple of million years, there have been these big variations between warm periods and cooler periods. And so there's a lot of natural variability in the climate system. And we believe that's driven by, subtle variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun, which are kind of complicated, but there are basically it's this, the sun and the seasonal cycle of sunshine that has been changing the climate on those timescales. But the thing that's interesting about that is that if you look at the difference in temperature between the last glacial maximum and 1800, it's about the same as the difference in climate between 1800 and the present. And but there's a big difference, which is that it took 18,000 years to get to 1800. And it only took 200 years to get from 1800 to now. And so the rate of change of climate, the natural kind of background rate of change of climate is I know, something like 100 times slower than the change in climate that we've seen over the past 100 years or so, and especially over the past few decades where climate change has accelerated. And so the rate of change and the pace of climate change is really dramatically different with this world that we have where we're putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So I think it's yes, there are large variations in climate in the past, but they are very slow compared to the changes that are occurring now. Yeah, and you mentioned the Salton Sea and the Colorado River. I mean, it is an interest. Salton Sea is interesting. It was produced. It's a man-made lake or sea, I guess, if you will, was produced quite a long time ago by the Colorado River being diverted into that region. But we kind of are stuck with the decisions that were made in the past, and now we're seeing climate change impact a feature that we created. And yes, that is sort of a man-made feature, but we still have to consider, I think, the impact of climate change on it as it dries up.
We need to. There's no other way around it.
Yeah.
So many folks that live around the area that are suffering from the air quality on a daily basis. And I think this is where the state needs to step up, as they stated they would when the quantification settlement agreement was agreed to back in the day. Our vice chair has her hand raised.
Thank you. I know we're pressed for time, but I thought this was a good opportunity for me to ask a question that I've been wondering a lot about is, well, I've been noticing wind also increase. There are longer periods, they're stronger. And I'm just thinking, is that also something that is part of this climate change that I think doesn't get discussed enough? And I also imagine it does impact these wildfires that we're experiencing, right? So I was just curious if that was also a factor that you all are looking into and is contributing, in fact, to a lot of these changes.
Yeah, well, another great question. The impact of, so there are differences in how certain we are about the impacts of climate change, and basically everything that flows from warming, we're pretty confident in, and those have been studied and understood quite a bit over many decades. The impact of climate change on the atmospheric circulation is something that is more bleeding edge, if you will. We don't know everything. There are areas of research that we need to develop more, and the effect of climate change on winds is something that I think we need quite a bit more work on, especially in California, things like the Santa Ana winds that are driving wildfires. I think it's a really important question. How does climate change impact the Santa Ana winds? Not only the strength of the winds, but also the temperature and humidity of the winds when they do occur, which we know that will affect wildfire as well. And so this is something that I didn't emphasize in my talk, even though I think there are impacts of climate change on circulation and winds, but I didn't emphasize it because it's not as certain. And I'm trying to represent the things that we have a consensus around. Not only my opinion, but also that of my colleagues around the world.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Any other thoughts from my colleagues? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And following up on the Vice Chair's comments, Dr. Hall, regarding extreme weather conditions, I grew up in Florida. As you remember, the kid in the 60s and 70s, hurricanes were, you could put down your wood and protect your windows, and it was 60, 70-mile-an-hour winds. But going back, visiting cousins after, Hurricane Ian and these others just wiped out parts of southern Florida dramatically they'd never seen.
Mhm.
So what about extreme weather conditions? Huge floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that that have hit, especially Texas, East Coast, South. What about that with regard to climate change?
Yeah, a lot of my work actually has been the impact of climate change on extreme precipitation and also drought. And that is, we think that with every degree Fahrenheit of warming, there's something like a 10 to 12% increase in extreme precipitation. And so we do expect precipitation to become more extreme with climate change. And a lot of those events that you mentioned, like those hurricanes, we've done like autopsies on those. Not me personally, but my colleagues have done autopsies on those to try to understand, well, if they had occurred in a world without climate change, how intense would they have been? And they do conclude that they would have been, probably somewhere around maybe 15%, 20% of the intensity is due to a warmer world. And so as the world continues to warm, those events we expect to continue to intensify. And in California, we also see probably part of our increasing tendency towards extreme wet years and extreme dry years is in part driven by the fact that we're in a warmer world. So we've had, of course, there were extremes before without climate change. I don't want to suggest that climate change is creating all of this extreme weather. It's not responsible for all of it, but a part of it is due to this warmer world that we're living in.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. How many folks do we have in the queue that are on Zoom, Wayne?
We don't have anybody with their hands raised, but if you'd like to give the public the opportunity to ask any questions.
Specific to this issue?
Correct.
Just really quick, folks, and I forgot to mention this. We do have a hard stop by 11:30. Obviously, we're going a little longer than we usually do. We usually go an hour per committee. This time we're going a little bit longer just because this is the first committee hearing or discussion in 15 years, but there are more to come. Now, if folks have points they want to make, ideas, thoughts, by all means, please bring them up. If you have questions, what I'd like to do is, just because of time constraints, maybe we could jot them down and work with Dr. Hall and obviously our staff, if that's okay with you, Dr. Hall, to help
Sure.
provide that information to those individuals that might have questions that might require a longer response. That sound like something we can do? Okay, good. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and open it up, Wayne, if there's anybody out that'd like to speak specifically to this issue.
No one has their hand raised.
Okay, moving on. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ha. Good
Thank
job.
you. Bye.
Go Bruins.
Yes.
Moving on. We have also now at this point, Dr. Sarah Reese, who will provide us an overview of regulatory and policy framework for climate change. I think we allocated for her 10 to 15 minutes to speak on this item.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, Chair Perez and members of the committee. So I'll be brief, Dr. Hall covered some of the front end of my presentation, but what I wanted to do is give kind of a high-level overview of climate change, what trends look like in California and the US, and then talk a little bit about the framework for addressing climate change, most of which is happening at the international level. California is certainly a leader, and then a little bit of how perhaps local governments like ourselves can fit in. So next slide, please. This is just an outline of what I'm covering. Again, a lot of this, the front end was covered by Dr. Hall, so I'll just touch on some of those salient points and then move through the rest of the presentation. Next slide. So when we talk about climate change, and I think we had a little bit of that discussion towards the end of Dr. Hull's presentation, it's not necessarily about individual weather events. You can have one hot summer and that does not climate change make. It's really looking at these trends over many, many years, hundreds of years. And we're starting to see some of those changes today on what examples of our future could look like with a changing climate. And so some of these signs are things like temperature certainly is one of the signs, but more extreme weather events, differences in rainfall and drought conditions, more extreme hurricanes and sea level rise. So those are kind of some of the things that we look at when we're talking about climate. These can be both naturally occurring. There was some discussion about ice ages, for example, and so we do see those variations, but again, over many, many tens of thousands of years. But then we also see man-made changes as well. Next slide, please. So current climate change patterns, without a doubt, from combustion of fossil fuel over the last several decades, most since the Industrial Revolution. Dr. Hall also showed this chart as well. We can see that greenhouse or carbon dioxide levels have gone up dramatically over time. Right now, the levels are above about 400 parts per million. These we haven't seen levels like this in the atmosphere in several million years. So very, very significant changes in those greenhouse gas concentrations. Next slide, please. Dr. Hall also talked about the greenhouse effect, where the atmosphere and some of the greenhouse gases in it act a bit like a blanket and trap some of the heat from and radiation that we get from the sun. It's a blanket that we need so that we can sustain life on Earth. If we didn't have it at all, Earth would be too cold to sustain life, but you can have too much of a good thing. And so when you have too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it can just keep increasing the heat of the planet. We've seen the situation with the planet Venus, for example. That's a planet that's similar in size to Earth. It's relatively close to Earth and is in the zone which hypothetically could sustain life, but its atmosphere is pretty much all carbon dioxide. It's a very, very thick atmosphere. And so that planet has what we call a runaway greenhouse effect, where the surface temperature is higher than the melting point of lead, and the atmosphere is very, very thick. Next slide, please. Types of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the primary one that we talk about, but there's a couple of other major ones. Methane's a very important gas to look at. Nitrous oxide. You've heard me talk about NOx and the importance of NOx for ozone formation. Well, this is nitrous oxide. It's not NOx, but it's still a nitrogen, 2 molecules of nitrogen, 1 molecule of oxygen. And then fluorinated gases also play a big role. Some other important greenhouse gases that work a little bit differently than the 4 main categories I mentioned. Water vapor, so that does have a factor as well. Ozone. Ozone's obviously very important to us for criteria pollutant issues. It does have some impact on global warming as well. And then black carbon also has an impact. Next slide, please. Not all greenhouse gases are created equally. Some of them have more potential to warm than others. And so we call this a global warming potential. Because they all differ a bit, we try to use carbon dioxide as the reference. So everything's calibrated to what the potential of carbon dioxide is. So carbon dioxide is a global warming potential of 1. But then you look at some of these other greenhouse gases and they're pretty potent. So methane's a pretty potent gas, and it is 28 to 36 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide, 273 times more. You look at one of the fluorinated gases, they're very, very potent. So sulfur hexafluoride, it's used as an insulator for electrical equipment for transmission and distribution, over 23,000 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So when we talk, you'll often hear when we talk about greenhouse gases, it's expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents. That's just to put everything on the same setting as carbon dioxide so we can have an apples to apples comparison of global warming potential. Next slide, please. This is just looking at greenhouse gas trends for California. This is since 2000, when California first started having a comprehensive greenhouse gas emission inventory. You can see that we hit peak greenhouse gas emissions in California in 2004. Pretty big dramatic decline coinciding with an economic downturn in the late 2000s. We did hit our goal of hitting 1990 levels back in 2014. So that was one of the goals was set out by the Pavley legislation, and that was achieved. Any guess on what happened in 2020, where we had a really sharp decline in carbon dioxide emissions? That was really from the pandemic and the economic downturn associated with that. We don't expect that that's going to continue. When we have revised numbers from California, we would expect that to rebound. From the 2022 scoping plan from CARB, there's targets for additional reductions. So wanting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 48% down from 1990 levels by 2030 and 85% down by 2045, and as well as reaching carbon neutrality by 2045. So that's going to require some pretty extreme shifts and work to transition to zero emission technology. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? Looking at the kind of the key sources, and I have two pie charts here, one looking at California, one looking at the US. Both of these charts are for 2020 emissions, which is the kind of the most recent data that we have. And you can see in California, transportation is a key contributor to greenhouse gases. Part of the reason for that is our electricity sector is relatively clean. So when you look at the US, for example, it's more evenly split between electricity, between transportation, and industrial sources. You can also see that residential and commercial sources play a role here. So heating from building, from other types of combustion that happen at those residential and commercial buildings is a pretty important factor as well. One thing I will point out is sort of the scale of emissions. So California in 2020, 369 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. You look at the US, California is a relatively small contributor compared to total US emissions. You might wonder why that is, because we're a pretty big state, we're a pretty big economy. We just, other states have a lot more power generation and it's coal-fired combustion, as well as bigger oil and gas interests. So for example, Texas is the single largest contributor among the states for greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And then looking globally. So this pie chart is looking at kind of the top countries contributing to global greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that China is the leader there. So that's a top contributor. It's followed by India, European Union. So that's all of the countries within Europe that are European Union members. US, 10% of the global contribution. And then California is a pretty small fraction of that. So this is not to say that we shouldn't be doing anything in California. We all have to do our share, and it's really important that we take leadership and show the world what can be done. But it's good to keep in perspective because this really is a global issue. And overall, we need to have global actions to reduce these emissions to get that to slow the development of climate change. Next slide, please. I think Dr. Hall touched on a number of these points, that we've had some pretty alarming news over the last several years in terms of increasing temperatures. 2022 was the 5th warmest year on record, but that tied with 2015. So we're actually having more and more of these warming events. We're seeing the increasing rate of global warming as well. So the rate of warming is almost twice as fast from 1981 to the current time versus 1880 to 1980. So we're seeing this rapid acceleration as well as these increasing incidents of warming. Next slide, please. And these are just some examples of what we call climate anomalies. So again, extreme events, kind of weather patterns you might not expect, what happened in 2022. Again, this is not necessarily saying that this is all from climate change, but these are examples of some extreme events that we might expect to see. So increasing wildfires, hurricanes in places you wouldn't expect them, like Southern California, increased temperature events like Europe being very, very hot, way hotter than what they used to be, as well as droughts and extreme rainfall conditions. Next slide, please. So in terms of measures to address climate change, there's kind of two big categories. One are mitigation approaches. So those are steps you take to reduce emissions so you can slow the progress of climate change. So those are things like cap and trade programs where you're capping emissions across an economy or across several sectors, reducing that cap over time, and then the industries figure out ways to reduce their emissions within that cap. Implementation of different rules for emission standards and cleaner technologies, as well as pivoting towards zero emission technologies. And then we also have adaptation measures. So these are measures that we take recognizing that climate is changing and there's going to be impacts as a result of that. And so what steps can we do to protect human health and the environment? And so things like building defenses to protect against sea level rise in vulnerable communities, looking at better strategies to ward off wildfires and to preserve forest health, reducing the urban heat island effect. It's important that you do both mitigation and adaptation measures because we know that the climate, no matter what we do, we are already experiencing climate change. We'll see some of these symptoms. We need to protect against it as well as to reduce emissions to slow the development of climate change. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about the international framework on addressing climate. And so we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, you probably heard about. This is a UN-convened body of scientists, and their role is to assess the state of science regarding climate change. The findings from IPCC are then funneled into the international treaties governing climate change. Next slide, please. So some observations from IPCC recently, very much showing that human activities, mostly through greenhouse gas emissions, have caused global warming. And so we're seeing global surface temperatures reaching above 1 degree Celsius, as Dr. Hall said, between 2 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit, above those pre-industrial levels. And then, also, even with the commitments the nations have been taking under the international treaties to reduce emissions, it's still likely the warming is going to continue to increase. So it's going to continue above that 1.5 degrees Celsius mark that was agreed to in Paris, and even likely that it's going to be harder to keep it down between the 2 degree mark that was also agreed to in Paris. Next slide, please. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, that is the international treaty regarding climate change. It's been in effect since March of 1994. This was the agreement that was brokered in the Rio meeting back in 1992. Today, it's been ratified by 198 countries. We call these parties to the conventions. So you might hear about the COP, or Convention of Parties. It just means that it's a meeting of all of the entities that have ratified this treaty. For our part, U.S. is a member. The U.S. delegation is led by the Department of State. And this treaty is designed to stabilize global greenhouse gas concentrations. It's two goals for it. One, at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, and then within a time frame that will allow, make sure that like food production is not threatened, that basic functioning can continue to happen. Next slide, please. The approach of this treaty is really to recognize the role that industrialized nations play, and that role is not equal for the developing countries. And so developed countries are charged to lead the way, both in terms of committing to emission reductions, as well as providing assistance to developing countries, recognizing that they lack the same kind of capacity to reduce emissions, that they're also developing. And so perhaps for some time, their emissions are going to continue to grow as they move their economies forward. And then also recognizing that some of the developing countries rely heavily on industries that could be intense in fossil fuels. And so recognizing that there needs to be some assistance for their economies as they transition. The Paris Agreement was the last big agreement that came out of UNFCCC. This was an agreement to hold global warming to within 2 degrees Celsius of those levels that were pre-industrial. And then the try was to get it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about our national efforts to address climate change. EPA has a number of regulations in place, both on mobile sources and on stationary sources that are squarely addressing climate. Greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide in particular is considered a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And so EPA is using that authority to develop standards to address that. EPA also has national greenhouse gas emission reporting requirements. And so we are able to collect the data and to track progress. Next slide, please. We also have a scientific body that's more US focused, similar to what IPCC does on an international level. This is the US Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. This is a panel that's mandated by Congress 14 member agencies contribute to that, and they develop a peer-reviewed assessment, the National Climate Assessment Report. This slide says that the fifth version of this was due in 2023. It's already out, and so we're already starting to see some of the results from that. I will confess I have not read it yet, but there's probably more information we'll be presenting on that in future meetings. Next slide, please. So again, these are what we've targeted in California. California has long been a leader in the US and in fact in the world in addressing climate. Back in 2006, we established a goal to meet 1990 levels of greenhouse gases by 2020, which we have already achieved, and then to get at least 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, at least 85% below 1990 levels, net zero by 2045. Very, very aggressive targets, I think utterly necessary in terms of the emission reductions that are needed and showing the way, but pretty daunting targets to meet nonetheless. Next slide, please. So what has California done to actually get to those targets? A lot of that is encompassed in the 2022 scoping plan, the most recent scoping plan that California has addressed. So the cap and trade program that California is one of the leaders in, that's a very strong feature of reducing emissions. Also established very stringent vehicle emission standards. You're aware of the clean car standards, as well as advanced clean fleets and the omnibus rules. There's a low carbon fuel standard in place to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels that are combusted, renewable energy standards, as well as green building standards. From the cap and trade program, their auctions generate significant funds. And so the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is the repository of all of that money. And that money is then used to deploy for other projects to reduce emissions. Next slide, please. Again, when you see California's greenhouse gas goals, the scoping plan, when you look at all the requirements that are in place, that does put us on the path to be able to meet those targets. Again, it's going to be very, very daunting and require aggressive action to pivot towards zero emission technologies wherever feasible. Next slide, please. So talk a little bit about how local air districts fit into all of this. And like, again, climate change is a global issue. There's a lot of work happening at a national level, but we do have a role. It is a little limited though. So there was legislation that was passed in 2017, effectively limiting the ability of local air districts to regulate greenhouse gas sources that are covered by CARB's cap and trade program. And I think that makes some sense. You don't want to have double regulation of sources that are already covered, but there's still, I believe, roles that local air districts can play in terms of facilitating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of other actions that need to happen to be able to get there. So if you turn to the next slide, Paul, just some concluding remarks. I think when I talk about pivoting to zero emission technologies, you've heard me talk about that in the context of our air quality management plan as well. We're starting to get to a point where the type of emission reductions that we need will benefit both, they're needed both for criteria air pollutants as well as for greenhouse gas emissions. So we really see these strategies starting to dovetail. We are going to be focused as a local air district still on doing what we need to do under the Clean Air Act to meet criteria pollutant standards. But we also need to, part of that needs to look at facilitating measures. So looking at approaches for infrastructure to facilitate zero emission technologies, for example, looking at incentive programs for energy efficiency and for zero emission technologies for buildings. I think there's a lot of work that we can do in that space to facilitate both of those goals. So with that, I think I'll conclude and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reese. It's maybe a question or two here. In your visits to other parts of the U.S. or in your visits to other countries, especially like China or what you've read about China and India, how have they embraced? I mean, how real, how genuine, how authentic are they to working with us as the United States and other countries that are really trying to fight climate change?
Yeah, I'm like, that's a great question. And a lot of it depends on, some of the particular circumstances going on with their economies. They might be in different places. I will say from my personal experience visiting China, they have definitely embraced that approach. When you look at electrification of transportation, for example, China is just, they transformed very quickly and very dramatically to pivot towards zero emission technologies. In the streets of Beijing, there are far more electric vehicles and different varieties of electric vehicles you would see than what we would see here in the US. But then at the same time, you look at how they generate their power, and it's still very dirty and it's still very carbon intensive. And so there are national plans that China has, and they kind of incorporate both greenhouse gas goals and air quality goals. And they revisit these plans every 5 years. So that is part of what they're looking at, but I think there's still a bit of flux. India is in a little bit of a different situation. Their economy is still developing. And so there's some challenges that they face in terms of how do you grow and develop your economy and then still reduce and deal with reducing greenhouse gas emissions over time. But I will say that there's definitely recognition of the urgent need. And they're also seeing the impacts, right? They're seeing some of these extreme weather events that are impacting their people, impacting food production, for example.
Have you heard much about Mexico? I bring up Mexico because I remember when I was a college student backpacking out there, and even afterwards, it never failed. I would get nosebleeds every single trip. And I would go quite a bit just because I like to visit. But I just remember seeing the air and what it looked like back then. I'm talking about maybe 20 years ago, even up until maybe 10 years ago. And constantly would have these nosebleeds and see this fuzziness in the air. And I also had heard that the current president, and I don't know if this is true or not, mentioned that climate change is not real, or is not necessarily promoting the fact that we need to do something about greenhouse gas emissions. How true is any of that in the sense of the president and what they're trying to do out there now, if they're doing anything at all?
Yeah, I must confess, I'm not quite familiar with where Mexico is on this right now.
Okay. I think that's something that I'd like to dig into a little further. Okay, my colleagues. Yeah, Kurt.
Thank you, Benny. And I have to apologize, I probably have to go before the 11:30 to make it back to my San Bernardino office. But just wondering, as we do these studies, I mean, I think all of us seeing the more practical side say, okay, global warming is coming. We have a part in making it better. When I looked at your first slides to show what California and probably specifically, how small that is in the global impact, I'm concerned about the practicality of one area becoming so big. I mean, so extreme that it basically forces industry or residents away from our area. I brought the local one because I know firsthand in my economic development department, I got people in the valley who want to move to the high desert just because of the two different air quality standards that we have within my own county. But then you look at California compared to other states, or frankly, exporting jobs across to the world that are not being part of this. And I guess it's part of our job is to figure out how fast to press on that accelerator to make change in order for our residents and businesses to absorb it. And I would love to see more and more studies on that. I mean, you hear about California losing population. Why would anybody want to leave California? In other states, granted it. Is it having to do with our policies? What scales? Is there a possibility to do exit surveys of people who move out, wherever the case may be? But I think, from talking with my kids and my family members, they're trying to establish their life. And they're like really considering leaving California for the first time in their lives, considering that because the jobs, the cost of living, the regulations, things like that. And I'm afraid if we go too extreme, that we may get to our goal in this board, but all of us have multiple hats we have to wear and try to consider the average of everything we do. And I never really see that impact studies of what it does when we say we're going to get to, in California, be, carbon neutral by 2040. Okay. What does that affect? We can't be that way. We may have to shut down the ports of Long Beach and LA and cut out LAX and our airports and do all these different things. But is that really what we want to do versus trying to stay ahead of the curve, being a bright star out there, being the good stewards, but still have a strong, vibrant economy and growing residential area at the same time. And so I see these studies, but I don't see the balance of it. At what cost? Dealing with carbon, an issue for my constituents right now, where and I won't get too much into details, this is probably going to be future things, but it's a labeling issue from a manufacturer overseas that came here, and the fines are, extremely high, in the close to 8 digits there, or 7 digits, whatever the case may be, for a labeling issue. Yeah, we have our mission here at South Coast. CARB has their mission. The state has their legislative goals. But we really didn't look at the cost of getting to those goals and what it's really doing to the state going forward.
Is that a rhetorical question, or is that?
I would hope that we can, as at least South Coast, bring some of those costs and some of those long-term studies. I love data. I love to see trends. I love this. I mean, the trends are us going down and for our better air quality is fantastic. At what cost are we using those things for?
Sure.
Yeah, Supervisor, maybe I can weigh in on this one. I think it's important to sort of recognize really where California and frankly where we are as a region in relation to not only air quality, but climate change. And I say that because we are the worst amongst the worst when it comes to air quality in the US. And what that means is we have a very long history of addressing air quality. Now, that distinction that we have about air quality in the United States is one that we've had a long time. But as you look throughout the United States, what you see is worsening air quality. And what you also see is a looking to how has it been addressed. And that gets to the issue of leadership out front with regards to developing air quality regulations and reducing emissions. The challenge that we now see before us is greatly impacted by combustion. And when we think about combustion, we think about energy production, we think about transportation, we think about heat. Anything that has a combustion source. We have developed those regulations. And to your point, Supervisor Hagman, how does all this impact us going forward? Where is our leadership role? Where is the cost considerations for that? As we're developing these rules and regulations, we look at the cost effectiveness. We look at those examples. So while they may be impacting us disproportionately more so now, what we do see is the greater investment and the greater benefits accruing to us as a result of that, where the rest of the nation then has to adopt the rules that we've adopted, make those investments at a later time. And I think one of the things that you're going to hear about by Lisa Tanaka O'Malley in our next presentation is how do we harness those investments in a way that provide the benefits and do it in a way that does exactly what you said, Supervisor, promote economic growth, promote that balance. We certainly don't want to see any of the major goods movement sectors shut down. That's not what we're about. And in fact, this district has proven time and time and again that we can develop air regulations and we can grow the economy. Much so to the point that our region alone is nearly the 8th largest economy in the world. The state of California is what, now number 4? So that's the leadership issue that I think that Supervisor Perez was talking about. We can take that mantle, we can develop programs. We do have some limitations in this case, given climate impacts, but we think that we can be a major contributor and a major supporter of efforts to address that, to address public health, and to address growth that you've just shared about.
No, thank you. And just a follow-up, Wayne.
Yeah,
So I love that mentality. I love to be the leader if I knew everybody else is going to catch up.
Right.
My problem is I don't think 98% of the other states are going to do, or the rest of the region don't have our geographical restrictions, don't have our good weather, don't have the mountains surrounding us. So the things we need to do to catch up, our worse air quality is not because we're not doing things the best. We're already doing it the best throughout the rest of the nation. So we can't, affect that geographical condition that we're under. So as we set these rules, if we went all electric fleets everywhere in our air quality district, do I really think in the next 10, 15, 20 years, the rest of the country is going to do it? Yeah, I don't think they have the same urgency because they don't have the same conditions. And so, and what we're seeing in like my other boards, like Omnitrans, I've been from diesel to clean diesel to electric to natural gas and now something else, hydrogen. And the cost of that for the agency, because we're expanding our technology. No one, and I went to the conference not too long ago when I was talking to electric vehicles versus hydrogen or, the fuel cells. The industry has no, like, this is what it's going to be. Everyone's going to be here for 20 years from now. So the cost of developing that technology, we're carrying that burden. And if I thought everybody else was going to do it, even my own county, if I thought everyone's going to do it, because they don't have the same restrictions. They don't have the same, like I said, the geographical barriers that makes us be that way. Then you say, okay, we could be number one, we can do the burden, but just know that you're going to be doing all this kind of stuff too. But a lot of cases, I don't think it's going to happen. And we talk to our friends in the legislature and Congress and stuff like that. It's like, I'm not going to impose this in my businesses. That's why I still have coal burning, power plants and stuff, because there is no federal level the same, everybody else to get to that standards because they don't have the same problems we have. So I guess it makes it unfair. I guess there won't be a balance eventually.
I like to take the optimistic view that there will be balance. And to the point that you make about, just even different regulations within your county. I think that's something that the federal government is actually trying to address. You see a number of actions, a number of litigation efforts being filed regarding what are called the good neighbor plans. And to the point that you make about Mojave having perhaps less stringent regulations than we do, the fact of the matter is that if an industry is to move to Mojave, to think that they're going to somehow have less onerous environmental requirements, the fact of the matter is those increased emissions in that area are still going to be transported. We're still going to have an impact. And that's what EPA is trying to address, is to stop those kind of impacts. So I am much more optimistic with regards to the harmonization of efforts and the real benefit that's to be derived. But someone has to make those investments. And I think that by making those investments, you see tremendous savings in future costs. Just look at electricity and solar. Look at the amount of investment necessary, and now look at the cost of production for those solar cells. We in the United States have a long way to go so that we can be competitive, but we see the benefits of those types of energy transitions. And within the United States as a whole, we are on the forefront of that. Now there's wind generation and other aspects that people are looking at. And again, I think California and investments in California set the way for those kind of investments that will be adopted. They have to be adopted. So like I said, I like to have the optimistic view.
I thank you for that. And I hope that's the case, because what I see is, every time we have like the last roll we did, I'm afraid those businesses will leave, my valley and move to the desert. And now I got more truck traffic going up in south. And if we push them out of the high desert and they move to Nevada, because there's not the same kind of thing, now we got even more truck driving. And so those are things I'm worried about. The businesses must stay competitive or they don't stay in business. And if the burden gets on between 10, 20, and we have different ones, we have, all different levels, not just clean air, but we also have the higher energy rates. We have higher gasoline rates. You add all that together, and we see a lot of those businesses, over the last decades, try to leave to other states where the climate's better so they can stay in competitive edge. And so that's where I'm saying that balance is. And I know we have to do it. It's just how fast can we do it and not, have harmful effects on our state.
Thank you. Supervisor Caccioti. Anyone else? Anybody on the Zoom? How about from the public?
We do have one hand raised in the public sector, and it's Mr. Harvey Etter.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Harvey Etter.
Harvey, you can unmute your mic.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes, you are, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Harvey Ed. Yes, you can hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. My name's Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition, and like-minded folks and entities. I'm extremely disappointed in Dr. Reed's report. And the very basic numbers have been distorted and changed on CO2 and their CO2 equivalent. Now, I'm referring to the 16 plan, the Solar New Deal, and okay, that plan was written by Dr. Katzenstein, okay? And in there, it says, in the last 12 years, there had been a 30% increase in methane worldwide, okay? That's very important. It turns out we put in the cover article of National Geographic from September in 19. And the cover was, the Arctic is thawing. They didn't even have the chutzpah to say it's melting, okay? I'm incorporating, okay, the numbers that were given for methane were, that she said, were from 20 to 34. 34 is what the Europeans were using. We were using 20 and carbon, and 25 is carbon. So that's global warming potential, molecule for molecule compared. Okay, that's on a 100-year scale when you're comparing methane. They changed that in AR5, and it used 86 basic, plus there's radiative forcing another 20%.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Javier. You had 2 minutes, and if you'd like your information that you have, you mentioned a report. Send it in. Let us take a look at it. I'll review it. And by the way, I think that Dr. Reese did a good job. And so I appreciate, Dr. Reese, your points that you made. And, you know, it's okay. We disagree at times, but at this point right here, we're just taking it all in. And thank you for calling in as well, Harvey Eder. You've been a champion in your own right. And, you know, we do listen to you. We do hear you. Okay, anyone else on the queue?
No, sir.
All right, great. Moving on. Our last presentation, and I think we're doing good on time. We have the overview of US EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, and this is by Lisa Tanaka O'Malley. And the floor is yours. You have about 10 to 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Supervisor Perez and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to present today. And in your opening remarks this morning, you and the committee members pointed out the need for federal funding to address climate change and air quality issues. So this presentation complements the policy discussions that we've just heard. The focus of my work here at South Coast AQMD is to exactly support that vision that you and the committee members laid out in your opening remarks by working as the lead local air agency with our sister agencies on the local level, state and federal, and that includes the agencies, our elected officials, our community organizations, and industry. And when I say industry, I mean that through our partnership with TAO, we're talking to the largest OEMs and businesses in the nation. And what we're trying to do is identify, track, and then receive funding through opportunities to address climate and air quality issues. And that's Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act and other opportunities. And the goal is to support the transformational change in our region that is equitable, helps our hardest hit communities. So we're looking for equitable transformation and to also support our businesses. That means access to clean technologies, workforce training, and economic development. We know that those things need to go hand in hand. And how are we doing this? I've been beating the bushes, organizing local meetings, regional meetings, coordinating with the state and our national partners, analyzing where we can leverage both our financial resources and our scientific expertise to bring about the changes we need for South Coast Air Basin, and that's for climate and for air pollution goals. And our congressional delegation has played a huge role in this, not only in legislating policies and funding opportunities, but helping us shape how those programs are being implemented through the notices of funding opportunity. And I know I've said this before, but South Coast is not afraid, and I think my colleagues are probably getting a little concerned because we are beating the bushes and going to agencies and community organizations that we may not be, the traditional fit for, but we know that we have to break out of the silos for this type of change, that we need to work across local, state, and federal and go to our community organizations that you mentioned in your opening remarks. This is a massive problem and we need to think outside of the box. So today I'm going to be presenting on the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, which is just one of many programs. In 2024, you will see 2 additional new EPA programs, as well as other funding opportunities. And I just wanted to share with you that we are out there, we are leveraging our financial resources, our scientific know-how, and our hands-on experience in implement research development and demonstration of these technologies that we know we need to go hand in hand with equitable transformation and jobs in the economy. So with that, next slide. Let me dig into the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. So again, this was created through the Inflation Reduction Act, and it supports everything that we've spoken about this morning. It is the complement to the policy. It is to provide the resources to get the job done for environmental justice, for jobs, and to really be transformational. Next slide. So I'm going to say CPRG because Climate Pollution Reduction Grant is a lot to say. CPRG has 2 overlapping phases. One is the planning phase, which was $250 million nationally, and on the implementation phase, $4.6 billion. And I'm going to go into the details of these 2 phases later in the presentation. Next slide. The timeline. I show you the timeline early on because this program is really no joke. The timeline is extremely fast. The key point is that the implementation grant proposals are due in April of 2024. So we have between now and April in 2024 to pull together as a region and a state to apply nationally. And the good news, though, is that EPA says that they're going to turn this around very quickly. So we could know of awards as early as July of 2024 with funding actually flowing in the fall. That's an extremely expedited timeline. Next slide. So phase 1, which is the planning grants. There are 3 distinct work products from these planning grants. There's a priority climate action plan, a comprehensive climate action plan, and then a status report. Next slide. I'm going to kind of dig into what those are a bit here, mostly the priority climate action plan. So in our region, the South Coast region, there were 2 metropolitan statistical areas that received planning grants. Those were $1 million each, and they were based on the population of your region. So there were 67 MSAs or metropolitan statistical areas in the nation. In the South Coast Basin, we received 2. We also have neighboring ones in Ventura, which is part of the SCAG region. In the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim area, which we're calling the LAOC MSA, there's a steering committee comprised of those organizations. And in the San Bernardino, Riverside, Coachella, which actually goes out to Mojave area, it's being led by their COGS. And please note that SCAG and South Coast AQMD is a leader in both of those committees. South Coast and I have participated in, helped organize and coordinate local and regional meetings, as well as with the state and then in the national level. Next slide. The state also received a planning grant of $3 million. And you can see all of the logos for the state agencies that are participating in the effort. This effort's being led by CARB with oversight by the governor's office. Next slide. So what is in a priority climate action plan? So this is really more of a blueprint for what you might see in applications for the implementation grants. Your PCAP, as it's being called, can focus on specific sectors. So these are the areas of greatest interest or concern from your metropolitan statistical area or the state. And so it's a very important document. It includes a greenhouse gas inventory, which we're working on with our sister agencies to develop through a consultant, as well as work with the state. And then it will quantify the reduction measures and have all different kinds of analysis, including a LIDAC analysis or low income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. Now the key, this is why the PCAP is important. It is a prerequisite to apply for an implementation grant. So in order to apply for the implementation grant, the greenhouse gas reduction measure must be in either your local priority climate action plan or the state plan. And so that is why we are coordinating so closely with our cities, our counties, the communities, our sister agencies to make sure that we are being very strategic about how the PCAPs are developed. So you can either apply under your local, again, or state. Next slide. In our South Coast region, there are two PCAPs. There is one for the Los Angeles OC and one for the Inland Empire. And I apologize, this is such a, the process is developing as we're speaking, so I do have a little update for this slide. In the LAOC area, we have already determined that our focus will be on transportation, goods movement, energy, which is largely building decarbonization, and waste. And then Inland Empire, when I was developing this presentation, they were still sort of thinking, it hasn't been 100% finalized, but they were looking to focus on building decarbonization as well as EV infrastructure. And they have an interest in goods movement. So those are the focus areas for our two MSAs. Next slide. The state PCAP is going to be broader. We know that they are going to include measures for areas that do not have planning grants and for which is largely the rural areas. And they also want to be broad enough to cover measures that the local MSAs are not going to include, such as like natural lands or carbon sinks. We're working closely with the state to try and come together on what they will prioritize in their key PCAP. And then later we'll talk about how the state and our region might be able to work together for the implementation grants. Next slide. So where we are right now with the PCAP, we are developing the draft plans, both in the LAOC and the Inland Empire. We're doing simultaneous outreach on the plans because of the short timeline to help inform their development. We will hoping to come out with drafts by the end of this year. It may look like early 2024 to seek additional input and to be able to integrate that input in before the plan is due in March of 2024. Next slide. So that's basically the PCAP. So we know that's the prerequisite to apply for the implementation grants, which is this overlapping phase. So next slide. So who is eligible, first of all, to apply for these $4.6 billion in funding? States, territories, federally recognized tribes, and then municipalities in a very broad sense. That includes cities, counties, agencies, air agencies, our county transportation commissions. It's very broad. Next slide. The implementation grants. Again, it's $4.63 billion for states, the MSAs, tribes, and territories. And then the tribes and territories can apply for a separate pot of $300 million. So they get to apply for both. We know that EPA has said that you can apply for a range between $2 million and $500 million per application. So that kind of gives you the sense of how many grants they might award. If you added up all of the maximum number of grant possibilities that they could award, it's around 115 or so. And we know that there were 117 planning grants awarded. So it's going to be a very competitive process. We also know that EPA has already publicly stated that they would like to make at least one award per state. So this just kind of gives you an idea of how competitive this process might be. Next slide. The sectors that you can apply for an implementation grant are very broad. Again, transportation, power, et cetera, you can see them there. And I wanted to emphasize that EPA is really focusing on how can you make transformational change and impact environmental justice communities. So I have the note there about the Justice 40 program. Next slide. This is very critical. So the project evaluation. EPA has been very public on what they're looking for to score well in this competition. They want shovel-ready projects. They want projects that are good to go. They want to see near-term emissions reductions in the 2025-2030 timeframe. So that means like things that we're kind of examining are existing projects that could be expanded, or programs that can need additional funding or can grow, things that have already been sort of worked on and are ready to go. Another huge focus for this program is not just the greenhouse gas emission reductions, but the criteria pollutant reductions. And this has been a mantra that we have really advocated for in all of these forums, is the co-benefits. These co-benefits will be especially important for our region in the low-income disadvantaged communities portion of this. That's a really important component of this proposal that we need to address. For us, we like to say we're turning our disadvantage into our advantage, because we are in extreme non-attainment for ozone and severe for PM 2.5. That really needs to be strongly put forward in all of our proposals. They're also looking, EP is also looking for workforce training and job opportunities, transformational changes, and equitably so. So that's sort of the project scoring. So what have we been doing? This really should say nationwide, statewide, and regional collaboration. South Coast AQMD early on sort of took the lead, and we were ringing the alarm bell that this program's coming out. We saw it in IRA, and we started taking meetings with our sister agencies and our counties and cities to pull together early. So we have weekly meetings. We have, I think I have like 4 CPRG meetings on my calendar every week. We have specialized working group meetings now on transportation and goods movement, energy, waste, and transit. And I wanted to emphasize here, which is really, I think, a fantastic development, is that the 2 MSAs, LAOC and then Inland Empire, are really starting to bridge together. We know that we do have some separate, goals and things, but where we can come together and leverage our work and be more competitive, we are doing just that. And it has been a very strong and rich discussion. It's been very helpful also because we are kind of a force to be reckoned with, I want to say, in the statewide discussions, because all of us are showing up and being present. And we also have been participating in the National Association for Clean Air Agencies discussions. So we have been presenting at all of the COGs. Myself and Ryan Wolf from SCAG, we've gone to all of the LA COGs, and then the San Bernardino, Riverside, and CBAG are presenting at their own COGs. We had a meeting in Orange County for the Supervisor Foley's office in partnership with the EO's office. We're working with CARB again, and we're working with communities to try and get early input. And SCAG will be hosting or conducting small focus groups throughout our region, LAOC and Inland Empire. So that's a really great partnership. Next slide. Information sharing. So one of the key things about this is we know is that we need to partner regionally or even larger. EPA will not award the same proposal in the same region or similar region. So information sharing is key. So we worked with SCAG and developed a survey that eligible entities can fill out. We will be publishing on a weekly basis or as needed the list of proposals that folks are interested in. So whether you're a community group or an eligible entity, you can look to see who you might call to find out how you can work with them. So this is a really good opportunity. Next slide. Again, pointing out the timeline for CPRG. We are sort of racing against the clock, developing both the planning grant side and the proposal side. One thing that's not on here is that we will have to submit a notice of intent for proposals in February. So that's February 1st. So it's coming up rapidly. Next slide. So in summary, I just wanted to point it out some of the key things. This is a highly competitive program. We're looking for near-term emissions reductions, projects that are shovel-ready. We're looking for strong co-benefits for criteria pollutants, air toxics as well with the greenhouse gas to impact our environmental justice communities, and also for transformational change for our jobs in the economy. And the last thing I wanted to end with is that all of this work that's really forced us to go outside of our silos is helpful in that as we look to other opportunities like clean ports or heavy duty vehicles, we've now created this really rich network of local, state, and federal partners so that we can be more informed and perhaps partner together on other grant opportunities. So really leveraging these opportunities and even working together on local funding sources as cost sharing for projects. So with that, I will end here and happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for your presentation. I appreciate the fact that you're out and about in the communities already doing the outreach. I know it's a lot of work, a lot of different entities, COGS, regions to go visit, a lot of folks to deal with, to work with, to partner with. And obviously it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work away from family as well. And so I appreciate what you do. And just the other day, we had our RCTC meeting, Riverside County Transportation Commission meeting. I think it was, can't remember even when I think it was yesterday morning. So many things going on. And we talked about how potentially, funding streams, funding formulas are going to be changing and how they're going to be more competitive and how potentially the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, mitigating them, preventing them, whatever we can do, is going to allow for higher points, if you will, for the building of a new bridge. And so I think that is something that we need to really consider moving forward, especially in areas that don't have that infrastructure yet, or areas in which have dilapidated infrastructure. So thank you for your work and your efforts. Any thoughts from my colleagues on the dais? Yes, Mr. Cascioli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lisa, thanks for coming to the COG. I got there a little bit late from another meeting, but I heard the presentation and participated. So I'm trying to, putting this together is almost impossible in 2 or 3 months. But as you're doing this and in the goods movement, I'm trying to picture almost like the Volvo Lights program we did, which was so successful, bringing all the partners together. So as you're doing are you like working with the ports of LA, the terminal operators, the PMSA, the labor, and then as part of that, I'm trying to make this like connection as with the goods movement. Then you've got the trucking companies, you've got charging infrastructure as it goes through the basin. Volvo, Daimler trucks, we had them. You've got the workforce. You've got maybe San Bernardino College, Rio Hondo we had before. And trying to tie this all, how are we putting that together in a goods movement? I'm just trying to picture it in my head. I got the general, but I need a little more specifics.
Yeah, your vision is exactly what we're trying to do. And we're still at the early phases, but involved in our discussions include the ports and our cities and county partners throughout, from the port area all the way through the Inland Empire. In the next stage, we will be bringing in, like you said, the truck representatives, the terminal operators are being represented by the ports and other entities, and OEMs. We know we need to have that to have a strong proposal.
And even as we do that with the railroads and stuff like that, I mean, at the ports, down, railroads start down there and go out the basin. UP, are they involved at all in this effort? I know there's other sources of funding, but
Yeah, we're you're absolutely correct. We are working on bringing together all of the different entities that might be involved, but we're still sort of in that building block stage. And I
Right.
think what you've outlined is where we want to go with it. We just had our internal meetings just among the working group members with the cities, counties, and the transportation agencies. And we'll be building that out to more of those entities as you described, the different operators.
So Vice Chair, maybe I could add a little bit.
Yeah.
This really is the planning stage, and it really is looking to all of those entities. What are their priorities? What are the county's priorities? What are the municipalities' priorities? How can we harmonize those efforts across a broader region? And then to the actual implementation, it's understanding what are the truck people that we want to have involved, the rail, all of those things that we're looking at, I think are critical for us to look at. And then, as an example, what's BNSF doing with regards to Mojave? That's why, we reached out to Mojave and want to make sure that Mojave's incorporated in this so that we can, again, look at the goods movement sector as a whole. But the initial effort right now is on the planning and preparation. And as we progress, then it will be reaching out to more on the implementation and who those players are and what those things are. But the goal is to maximize the amount of funds that come to the region so we can implement those projects.
With respect, like to the county for Riverside, LA, and even the cogs within, as many said, we're jumping back and forth to meetings. A meeting I was in with you, city managers all sitting around there, and I just jumped in, but they're so busy. You've got 5 meetings a day. You're doing your regular jobs here at AQMD, and we're still trying to, this additional grant besides the other grants your staff's working on. I just, again, there was like 50 people in that meeting when I saw you and the gentleman from SCAG really working hard. And they were throwing some good ideas, but I could tell and if I hadn't jumped in and gave them some ideas, the city managers were kind of stuck because they've got their other things they're planning, like Wayne's, they're the Wayne of our cities in the county. And they want to participate, but they just not going to have the time. So it's the oars on your back, I hate to say it. And you're just, our staff and SCAG, we're gonna have to push. I don't know about your, Manny, but the 34 cities I saw there at that meeting, in the San Gabriel Valley from La Cañada all the way to Claremont up to your border, they want to, but they're not gonna have the energy resources. So I just, it's really gonna be us to make this thing successful. And I like your ideas. How can the cities, we'd like to see some money too for the counties and the city, even though it's goods movement. Can we, as part of that trail out to Riverside and San Bernardino, can we have the cities and say, we're trying, the San Gabriel Valley COG. We want all electrification. Besides the goods movement, we want to see all of our heavy duty trucks, our off-road construction equipment every city has. We want that electrified. Can we throw some of that in there too for the cities, or no, is that out of question?
I think the challenge is when you're trying to put together the funding applications, a lot of people weren't necessarily aware of it. And we're trying to look at the larger areas, the large municipalities, like the city of Los Angeles. Like technically for the LA Metro, the city, well, the county is the lead, but the MSA was actually awarded to the city as the largest MSA. So what we're trying to do is to pull all these groups together that have that broader representation. So SCAG, for instance, does see all of those things. But I think what's happening right now is that you have a lot of the smaller cities saying, oh, wait a minute, there's a PCAP, there's opportunities for money. I want to get in on it. And it's at the last minute. And so it's really difficult to, I think, affect what you're doing. We're trying to maximize that outreach, working with the larger entities to pull them in. But there are going to be those who will feel that they weren't involved soon enough or have enough of a stake. I think that's just part of the challenge. We see the same thing happening amongst the MSAs at the state level. We want to see more coordination at the state with what we're doing so that we're not necessarily competing against one another.
Right.
So it is a tremendous challenge. It's much more difficult than herding cats, and Lisa is doing a fabulous job of making sure that from a South Coast AQMT perspective, that we harmonize and maximize the co-benefits associated with GHG reduction and the criteria pollutants, and then focuses on the things that we heard about earlier.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair Casciotti. Okay, time check. It's 11:30. Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to make sure though that is there anyone in the queue?
Yes.
How
We have
many-
one person signed up, Supervisor. It's Mr. Etter. He spoke before, but you did mention giving time for each of the items. You could reduce the time if you chose.
No, that's fine. Give him 2 minutes, but he has to speak on this issue. Go ahead, Mr. Etter.
Yes, hello, am I being heard?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to talk fast. I think if you give me more time, I question, basically you don't want to hear the people, apparently. Okay. We submitted the Solar New Deal in 16, working with Dr. Burke. Okay. It was about the
This is
Sunshine
not related to
program.
this item. I'd encourage Mr. Etter to focus on this particular item.
Mr. Etter, did you hear that? We discussed the grant program. You have anything to say on the grant program?
Okay. All of the grant program has to do with planning. Our plan is the controlling plan. The Sunshot Solar New Deal was not evaluated, Department of Energy, by the district, the CARB.
Again, this is not related to this item. Let's move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, legal counsel.
Supervisor.
Yes, sir.
The Vice Chair, Padilla Campos, had her hand raised
Oh,
also.
sorry. Vice Chair, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I know we were pressed for time. I really wanted to thank everybody for the presentation. I understand there's a lot of planning that happens and none of that is funded while doing that. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the work. Leave it at that because of time.
So was that, your question is for the planning, is there funding for the planning? Is that what you asked?
No, I'm pretty sure there isn't any. There isn't any plan, any
Can we
funding.
address that?
These grants never do allow
I thought there was $1 million for planning, right, for LA
Yeah,
County?
there's in our
No, what I
region-
mean, not for, I mean, what we're doing now, all the convening that you're doing with folks and, your time and stuff, like none of that, the prep work is what I mean. Like none of that is funded, right?
She's right. We're not getting funding for this.
Right,
No.
that's what I meant. So that's why I wanted to just thank you because I understand the effort that it takes for all that. And I did just also want to say the priorities that I saw listed, the goods movement, energy, and like decarb and waste. I also was happy to see those as priorities. So those were just comments I had. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair, and obviously that is the goal. We've always had a struggle, 90% since I can remember. We're not receiving the adequate amount of funds to really meet the needs of not only our communities, but as well policy at state level. But I guess that goes back to the issue of advocacy and continuing those efforts on an ongoing basis. And yeah, we do have an ambitious platform here from this committee. And I will continue to keep it that way. And maybe we tackle one bit at a time. But you're absolutely right, Vice Chair Padilla Campos. Unfortunately, this committee here, or ad hoc committee, for example, the efforts of our staff, the folks that are coming, our consultants, there's no funding for this piece of the puzzle when it comes to South Coast Air Quality Management District. And so with that, our last item, Wayne, next steps, take it home and keep it short.
Thank you, supervisors. So I think what we heard is that we need a whole of government, a whole of world approach. I don't need to do the slides. I'm going to skip the slides. And with that approach, we do have limited authority, but it's the partnership and it's the leadership. And it's focusing on the co-benefits, I think, where we see the most value. And so from your points that you made earlier in terms of what you want this committee to do, I think the question is, what do we do going forward? And the South Coast AQMD does have a climate change policy. It was developed over 15 years ago, dated in 2008. It is part of the agenda packet. One of the first things that we recommend is that staff revise that policy based on input from board members. And we'd like to be able to get input from each of you as well as the public and bring a revised draft back to you. We're looking at meeting on a quarterly basis moving forward in order to give us the time to collect a lot of the information. And I think also one of the things that Supervisor, you had shared with us previously is we need to educate. And we want to make sure that this is a good forum to hear what is the latest with regards to climate change activities and efforts. So we want to look at another potential speaker coming at the next meeting, and we'll be working on doing that as well. But I think to the extent that we focus on, for instance, securing funding, so all of the things that you heard Lisa talk about with regards to identifying partnership opportunities in goods movement and decarbonization, in infrastructure, in zero emission technology deployment. Those are the kind of things that we want to be able to bring back. And the other aspect that we've also talked about internally is how can the board and we as staff have a better appreciation for what our actions really mean from a GHG aspect. So we want to start looking at some of our rules. What are the GHG impacts? And at least have the board aware of those efforts so that we have, at least in the forefront of our own thoughts, that we really truly are addressing both climate change and criteria air pollutants. So those are the things that we want to come back with. We'll be coming back to you, as you said, for specific dates for the next meeting of the Climate Change Action. We hope to have some very exciting speakers, a revised policy, and perhaps a little bit more detail in terms of what we see on the funding, as well as other opportunities to demonstrate leadership on the stage. And that really concludes what I was prepared to say, Supervisor.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your points. And obviously, there was quite a bit that was discussed. And as far as next steps are concerned, I like your idea of maybe conducting a survey of sorts, if you will, of not only this committee, but I think just overall. You know, not everyone has an opportunity to sit on this committee or ad hoc committee, and then that way, you know, we are able to maybe pin down a couple of items. Obviously, resources will be number one, but that's for everything we do. But potentially it could be workforce, or it could be infrastructure, it could be anything else. So I think that's a good segue as far as next steps are concerned. Another thought that I have in mind regarding next steps is I'd like to see if we could have these gatherings, these meetings, maybe once every 4 months, if possible. I know that we haven't had one in a while. I know that we have a lot of standing committees and obviously our general body meetings. But I'm trying to find that balance. You know, if it was up to me and if we had the funding, we would do it at least a couple times a month. But, you know, we know that's difficult. Even maybe one gathering every 3 months might be too difficult. So maybe it's one every 4. I'd hate to do it twice a year. I don't think that's going to be enough. So let me just put that out there. And as far as goals are concerned, you know, there's a lot of great goals that we have, like obviously reduce climate and air pollution, support jobs and lower energy costs, and address environmental justice and so forth, pursue innovative policies. But I think the overarching goal outside of environmental justice is economic justice and social justice. And what I'm getting at is we need an overarching goal that supersedes these goals, meaning that how do we ensure that we keep families that are struggling, the disadvantaged communities, the working class, right there side by side with those individuals that potentially have more resources, more affluent, and can afford those Teslas. Not everyone can. It's, let's make sure that we think about that, because if we're able to think about that on an ongoing basis, then I think that informs our purpose and allows us to work on these goals, these other set of goals, but with that being front and center. And so those are just my thoughts as we are finishing this meeting. And Mr. Caccioti, Vice Chair Caccioti, any thoughts on next steps or any of my colleagues?
Vice Chair Padilla-Campos, did you want to go first, or I can go after, before you, whatever you want?
It's just I can't see you, Vice Chair. That's why. Okay, go ahead.
Chair, I would just, again, as I brought up in my initial comments, I think this is an incredible opportunity as you, the Supervisor Hagman, Wayne, all of us have described. We can't do it alone. We need partnerships. I really want to incorporate somehow the leadership of all the faith communities in this basin. Because, when I first got on the board, I realized you can't make change unless you change a person's heart, Manny. They're not, we can do all the rules we want to, but if individuals, businesses, cities, counties, if they don't understand what's happening out there, there's never going to be a change. So I really want to, maybe one of our next speakers is, I'd like the head of each of the faith communities, the Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Buddhist temple, give me 3 to 5 minutes, Manny, and what are you doing for climate change? I mean, what is each of them? They're not the experts, unfortunately. I think as you talked about in Wayne, there's got to be an education and awareness campaign here. And I understand, just in my Roman Catholic heart, which is the biggest church in the world, I don't think the Pope's the most educated. All the way down, it's not happening. The word hasn't gotten down to the local soldiers. So I think we have an opportunity to really educate a huge portion of our faith communities, Manny, which you started here, and with what a lot of the different faith communities are trying to do, but they're floundering out there. They're not sure where to go. We're the one that can bring that you've established. We can bring this all together and really make a difference out there, and give them the tool. Again, just talking to pastors, bishops I've talked to, so I was in an event recently where the people that train the priests in the seminaries about social issues, Manny, about climate change, the environment, they're not getting it. So as they come out, they don't understand it. They understand the bureaucracy, how they can participate, how they can help, even how you can, if every church, temple they just converted all their vehicles, all their trucks they use to transport food and things, and all the lawn equipment can make a little dent, but it's important. Mm-hmm. So we have an opportunity here to educate millions of people on just this issue with the co-benefits, as Wayne always says, of reducing criteria pollutants, meeting our federal standards. And the last comment is, there was between Wayne and Kurt, and I'm with you, Manny. I want to move progressively slowly. I don't want to lose jobs. But one example came to me on KNX driving home the other day where they said, wow, the economy is actually doing well because there's been a bump in consumer spending this last month because gas prices went down 20 to 30%. What if every person, like Supervisor had a Prius, he's got a hybrid. What if instead of paying $5 for gas, they're paying $1 for electricity? And that $4 they're saving, like I've saved over my 20 years, now crazy little story about the Prius, they're putting back in their local economy for buying shoes for their kids to play soccer. They're able to take the kids out for a pizza or for a McDonald's. Like when I was a little kid, my parents, that was our thing. Here's a McDonald's Big Mac. That's your big sandwich. So they're investing because, as Wayne said, you've gone to a new technology that you're not paying $6 for gas. You're paying $1 for electricity. And the $5, the $200, $400 they're saving a month, they're buying things at the store. So our economy is benefiting. So there's so many benefits here, Manny. I'm grateful to you for doing this. It's visionary. And we have an opportunity to really make a difference now. I hope we can meet quarterly instead of every 3 months, or every 3 months instead of every 4 months, because we can really do a lot this year.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. Caccioti, but stay away from the Big Macs, folks. No bueno.
That's when I was a kid. I realized.
Vice Chair, I can't even handle that number. Vice Chair Padilla, please.
Thank you. I do see where Board Member Cacciari is coming from, because I think that the faith-based community is definitely a place where outreach needs to happen. And there are some churches that have subcommittees on environment. So it's, I think, something we need to definitely think about tapping into, because that's where folks, it's a trusted entity, right? Where they can get more information. But I just wanted to say that my hope is that we can really center this on equity, you know, and all communities that need this attention the most. So that this is my hope for us moving forward on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I don't think I have any other colleagues on the line, correct? All right. So moving on to other business. Is there any other business?
Do believe there was a public comment signed up for on item number 5, Supervisor?
Is that
Mr.
by?
Eder. Mr. Eder.
Okay, let's wait on that for public comment period.
It's actually listed as a separate agenda item, so I'd recommend we take it and that it be limited to what was just discussed.
Okay, that's fine. Harvey, are you on?
Hello, this is Harvey. I'd like to agree that with the Padilla, we got to deal with equity. This 40% ought to be extended, not just to systems, dollar amount put in for reducing air pollution, but that the ownership, the control, the decision-making be given to the local communities and the workers, etc. And that this should be a qualification for any type of funding that comes out at the local, state, or federal level. And this has been brought up in COP recently, and there's a big split going on. I don't know, I hadn't even heard that talk about here, but anyway, I'm going to reserve time. I don't know if I'm making public comment now or not. I guess I still have public comment, correct? So I'll shut up.
That's correct. Well, thank you for that. Your point well taken, Harvey. And yes, you will have an opportunity for public comment. Other business staff? The only thing I would just add is I want to thank Estefania Navarro Gonzalez, my intern back home, who gave me this to read. November wrapped up 6th warmest autumn on record for US. She's probably watching right now. And obviously it talks about hurricane season 2020, 2023 remains at $25 billion in disasters so far this year. So obviously environmental justice, social justice, economic justice, and overall even the cost on our society as a whole, this plays a major impact. So with that, if we could finish off with public comment. How many folks do we have?
At present, we have Harvey Eder.
Okay, Mr. Harvey Eder, take it home for us.
Hello. Okay. I was a solar education, I'm Harvey Eder, speaking for myself and PSDC, etc. I was solar education specialist for the county of Santa Cruz 45 years ago. Okay. So I feel a need to educate. Okay. The real number for greenhouse gas, and I'm using a Sir David King and incorporating podcast number 95, where he talked with Nate Higgins in the Great Simplification. He said they use 120 now, okay, and it's 2 times that. And we put this on the 12th of August of 16 in response to the stuff about methane going crazy, and also there's nitrous oxide. We heard a 77 number from the doctor. Okay, she's a chemist and an attorney. That's intellectually and scientifically dishonest. This is really outrageous. The number is at least 200. It's 288 minimum, 300, and it's gone up 10 times in 10 years when they checked it about 5 years ago. Okay, this stuff, this number is 780. And this guy Hansen, he badmouthed solar. He put this dreams of the storms of my kids on stuff on, and he said you cannot do solar. And he started talking to supporting taking it out, a crutch to the fossil fuel industry. They're talking about doing like over in Dubai and all this crap now. Solar can do it. We invented a beer can solar collector. Aluminum is cost effective. It can be used for reflectors also to get high temperature concentrators. And there's thermal storage that's been proven is totally ignored and is being taken over by the vested interests and as they badmouth it. This stuff has got to be taken by the horns now and dealt with honestly and immediately. And this is an existential issue, and the answers are out there and they're being ignored. They are being also Hansen is only in the discussion with this guy. This guy is out of Cambridge, Sir David King. Okay. And he ran for 20 years and he said, we're going to do this like in 08 and our government stopped it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Javier, for your comments. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, but I appreciate other points that you made, Harvey, and obviously you're always welcome to speak at our meetings. Unless there's anything else to be said by my colleagues or by staff, this meeting is now adjourned. I pride myself on trying to finish our meetings in the time I said, but I knew it was gonna take a little longer. So I kind of try to juke a little bit and say 11:30, knowing we're probably gonna end at 12. If I would have said 12, we would end at 1. All right, folks, thank you so much for everything. We'll see you all next year. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Feliz Navidad. Feliz Día de los Reyes.
Thank you,
Thank
Chair.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh,